Hello there. What is going on, everyone? We're going to be talking about Star Wars Legion's new edition, asking the question, is it any good? I initially had a lot of concern and trepidation when they announced this new version of Star Wars Legion, and it seemed to me like it had so many sweeping rules changes and so many adjustments to the game combined with almost every character being adjusted. There was just so much that I felt like it was going to be a whole new game. And in some ways it is, and in some ways it's good, and in some ways it's not so good. So I want to talk about it today, asking the question, is it any good? I've had the chance to play numerous games now, and my opinion of the initial shock of the rule set reveal has evolved a little bit. And I thought this was a good time to bring up 10 key points that will address and the ways it's changed, and hopefully help you to arrive at maybe your own conclusion, but also you definitely play it if you're on the fence and you want to hear what I think. That's what we're going to talk about today. Also, there is still time left to enter to win that $25 Amazon gift card giveaway. You just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. It's as simple as that. Don't forget to check links in the video description below. You can join our Discord, social media links, Twitter, Facebook, all that other good stuff. It's all down there. And with that said, here are 10 points that kind of help to answer the question of, is it any good? So let's start off with the first big overhaul change, Turn 0. This is where a lot of the game has changed. Everything ranging from the battle cards of old being gone and there being all new battle cards. This one is a mix. I feel like there's a little bit less diversity when it comes to mission types. Everything is, using these large Pokeball sized, these 2-inch objectives and or POIs as they're calling it. And after you get past the shock of having all new cards, both for primary objectives and secondary objectives, and that's really what makes the game have a big change, is that your primary objective is just part of it, probably about 75% of it or 2/3 of it, and then your secondary objective is also important. And whatever combination of those you get is what can really make your battle cards in your particular game feel a little more unique. However, there's still only 6 of each type, and you're bringing 3 in a deck, so it's in a build. So as more come out, I think that part will get a little bit more rewarding. But overall, right now, it's very different. But it does end up lending itself towards a game system that feels familiar while not exactly the same. The objectives are a little bit larger. You don't necessarily have to be in base contact with them anymore. You can actually be contesting an objective even if you don't have line of sight to it. Sometimes they're in your opponent's deployment zone and you have to get there. It's not like Breakthrough feels very similar to the old Breakthrough, but there's key differences in that it's about securing an objective, having more leaders there than your opponent does, rather than just having the most units kind of cross the finish line. So if you had a 14 activation unit, you're not going to automatically get a win, things like that. But there's definitely some added randomness, and this is a little bit of a negative. The fact that you can't, when there's a veto system, that does feel a little familiar. When you're going to veto something, you don't know what card is going to come out to replace it. There's a little bit of probability, whereas if you're vetoing one of your own cards, you know the other 2 that are remaining. And if you really want one, you can try to veto your own like twice to make sure you get that one, and hope that your opponent doesn't have a veto left after you. But it is more randomized than before, and that can be a negative thing. It's fine. It probably leans itself a little bit more towards casual play, a little bit less towards the competitive player who's looking to have more definitive options. But that's not a huge swing either way. It's different. It feels a little different, but still feels familiar. The bigger change with the Turn 0 and that initial mission board is the fact that the game is only 5 turns. You start off the board and it plays until 12 points. So in most of my games, I haven't had a single game that's actually gone to the end of turn 5 yet. So most of them are turns 3 or 4 that I have found that games end up ending. Some of them were in tournaments where they went for time. Some of them just went to the score being done earlier than that. Speaking of deployment and other things, let's talk about turn 1, which is probably the single biggest change to the way the game is actually played, in my opinion. That the fact that everybody starts off the board. Well, almost everybody starts off the board. There are a lot of keywords that impact deployment and impact deployment differently. Scout largely feels the same, except again, you do have to start off the board. So you're not starting in your deployment zone and then moving out. You're starting at the board edge or at the edge of one of your deployment zones. There's prepared positions and infiltrate that let you start on the board, but in your deployment zone. And then there's transport, which is really good, although not as good as it used to be. Transport is a mixed bag because it's a shadow of its former self, which would allow you to drop like fleet troopers and Black Sun and those really hard-hitting range 1, range 2 type of troopers in the middle of the battlefield such that they can do an alpha strike and immediately hit an enemy. And that used to feel really, really good. Now it's a harder thing to do. However, transport is probably the strongest of all of the early deployment methods, having its ability to like drop your transport vehicle, and then after it does its first move, that's when you drop the deployed unit that's been transporting the disembarking unit, and then they get a face-up order token and then still get to do their own moves. So you can get them pretty far forward, and that does feel good because even though you're not going as far forward as you used to, that also means your opponent's not going as far forward as they used to, but it still can get you pretty far across the board, and that's a good thing. So that's one part of deployment in turn one, but the other things is that since everybody's starting off the board, there's so much more strategy that goes in that initial deployment that this feels very, very weird. In some ways it's bad because like your first unit that comes out there is very, very vulnerable. For example, if your opponent's going to have snipers, you can move and shoot, but most units in the game aren't going to be able to move and shoot because most deployments tend to happen out, beyond firing range of range 3. But people who are range 4 or 5 or higher, a lot of snipers will more often than not be able to deploy and shoot, especially since a lot of snipers have the scout keyword that's going to let them get at that extra move onto the board and get them a great vantage point or get range to whoever they want. And so it's very likely that if you deploy somebody early and you decide to actually try to get them farther into the board, that there will be enemies that deploy with line of sight of them that can try taking them out early before you have other units that could help them. For example, if you have people with Guardian and stuff, you might not be able to guarantee that the Guardian is also out there, so somebody can be out on the battlefield kind of by themselves. And that's risky, and that kind of boils into the strategy of how deployment is changing the game. It's changing who we activate on that first turn, and it's drastically changing that first turn command card. And that's a really big deal. Sometimes you want to play standing orders first turn. I used to always do that, but now it's not necessarily a great idea because you will be deploying sort of randomly, and that can really hurt you, especially if your commander has to go out first and you can't benefit from some of the new keywords that we're going to talk about. So you might have to deploy them kind of behind line of sight blocking terrain, and maybe you wanted to try to deploy them farther forward than that, but you're like, oh, I can't, I'll have to move and just take a dodge token instead of doing a double move to deploy and get into a good position for the following turn. The strategy is massively changed in deployment, and because the strategy has changed so much, this is the longest turn of the game by far. Turn one is in all of my early games, and everybody that I've played against that's also learning this new rule set, this one is the most different and takes the longest. And this turn, well, I'm sure in the future people get more familiar with early strategies, and this turn will start going quicker and quicker. Right now, it's definitely contributing to longer game times, and such that while the game is probably supposed to be played a little quicker, that hasn't been my experience just yet. It's been just as long, if not longer, than normal games of Legion. So kind of about the same. In my latest games, they've gone a little bit quicker. And so I can start to see the signs that once you kind of get the new system and some of the new strategies and you start to commit those to memory, that this part will speed up a little bit over time. But big change, and it's not necessarily a bad change. This feels the most different from how Legion was before, but it still feels like Legion. Moving on, passing. This is a very difficult thing for me. Now, passing is something that AMG introduced a while back, where you could pass once in a round, and now passing is done very differently. So if I've got 10 activations and you've got 7, you look at the difference, which is 3, you subtract 1 from that, and then the player with a lower amount gets that number. So this player with only 7 would have 3 minus 2 equals 2 pass tokens. Not a whole lot of math there, but it's just something you have to figure that out at the beginning of every round. And the idea is that the pass tokens slow your opponent, or basically they slow your opponent down from being able to save like 5 activations until the end. If they heavily activate you, you're not gonna run into a situation where they get like the last 3, 4, 5, strong activations, and then just kind of run all their heavy units right through you when you can't react. Passing usually works that way, but you also can't pass back to back, or you can't take an advantage token to pass, basically. There is a way that you can pass back to back, but it's only if you were to do a normal pass and then you happen to pull a token from the bag of unit that's already been killed and you can't use that token, then that time you can pass as well. So there's different types of passing, but normally you get advantage tokens, what used to be the old condition tokens, and you use those to pass now. And but again, you can't pass back to back. Not really a big deal with that. It only really becomes a problem if your opponent has killed so many of your units that they have more than double your remaining activations, and then you're going to eventually, the math isn't going to add up where you can just like activate one, pass one, activate one, pass one. You'll eventually still run out. But it's also something that you have to recalculate at the start of each round, and I found in a lot of my games that becomes something, at least in the early games, that we've forgotten to do a couple of times, and then had to go back and check. My first game in the new edition, we didn't even we totally forgot about passing altogether. So it's something that I think is overall it's pretty good. But also some of the times when you really need to do it, it's also very tricky because like, I really don't want to pass right now. I really need to activate something to take some dodge actions, or to tie this person up, or to get close enough to him to provide backup or something like that. So I think it's probably strongest on the first turn. When you're really trying to be very, very tactical. But once it becomes aggressive, and I do think that the game itself has become more aggressive with aggressive positioning and aggressive combat, shooting and charging into places that maybe leave you a little exposed or a little vulnerable at the cost of or at the the risk of being vulnerable, but the payoff is that you might be able to take out a unit that was contesting an objective. I feel like it's a little more, it's a more aggressive game, and passing is only situationally needed right now. So it's neither good nor bad. It's just interesting, and it's a whole nother mechanic to remember to do each turn when you're already calculating objectives at the end of each turn. So that's something. Next, cover. This one I know people have mixed emotions on it. As a whole right now, I do not like the cover system that much. I don't hate it, but I have been very disappointed, largely because I believe my white dice aren't very good white dice, whereas other people's white dice tend to do a little better than mine. I have only once ever actually blocked 2 hits with heavy cover in all the games that I've played so far. For the most part, I count as both light or heavy cover as basically not doing anything at all in my games. So, but the new rule is basically if you've got heavy cover for every hit, not crit, but every hit that is inbound to you before you get to save, or apply impact or spend dodge tokens and stuff like that, you will roll a white defense die for each hit symbol. And then every block or surge, you cancel one of the incoming hits. If it's only light cover, you still roll the white dice, but you only count blocks. You don't count the surges. So you're twice as likely to cancel some hits if you have heavy cover. It just so happens that the only time I ever roll surges is when I have light cover, and it doesn't matter. It's a big feels bad when cover does nothing for you all game, and then you finally get a big shot on your opponent, and then they cancel half your dice when they get a great cover roll. So it does lead to some like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me moments. So it increases the randomness to the game, and that part I'm not super crazy about, but I understand why they did it. They wanted small dice pools to still have a chance to get through. I would argue that they always had a chance to get through, but they needed criticals to get through. And with the proliferation of the critical X keyword, I feel like it was more and more likely for that to happen. However, that's not the way AMG saw it, and so they instituted this new cover system. I'm not super crazy about it. That's kind of how it is. But learning to deal with it. It's not the end of the world, and it's always something that potentially could get updated and changed, because I don't think this rule set is completely final until next year. So, and it's always a living rule book anyway, so they can always make adjustments and tweaks to rules. This is one I could see some tweaks possibly coming to, but that's my own personal opinion. And of course, I haven't played a million games yet, so there's more time for the ideas on that to evolve. But when your opponent has really hot white dice and you don't, it makes cover feel a lot worse than it used to when it was static. You could count, you could depend on the fact that it was going to block 2 hits. So it feels a lot worse now. Backup helps to mitigate the lack of cover. However, it's a new keyword similar to Lookout, Surf, or Warhammer. What it does is if somebody's attacking a hero of yours, a commander or operative, and you've got some core troops nearby that are not suppressed or don't have suppression tokens equal to or greater than their courage value, then you can cancel 2 hits. They can basically, tell your leader to look out, and you cancel 2 hits. Now, usually it's got to be core, but there are some exceptions, like for example, retinue and entourage and things like that. So there's a whole section in the rulebook about what can give you backup, but basically it's a way for, if your leader's fighting with the troops, they're going to have a better survival chance, whereas if your leaders or your heroes are going out on their own, completely isolated on their own, they're more likely to get shot down. So this one encourages you keeping at least a couple of units close by with your heroes, and it helps. But then again, there's lots of ways to impact this by suppressive things on those core units that are trying to provide backup. So but if I'm the leader and I'm trying to keep my leader alive, I don't mind if you shoot my core instead, because that's even better, because then I take no damage at all. But backup is good. It definitely works with that. I also think it works really well if you have a Jedi that's your leader and they're using something like Force Barrier, because now the troops can help protect the Jedi, but then the Jedi can use Force Barrier to help protect the troops. And then hopefully you also have cover too, which you'll roll all those white dice and they'll all be blank and it did nothing. So, but backup has really helped me out in a couple of my games, and it's a kind of it's a neat mechanic. It's not always going to happen. It's not always going to be a big thing, but if you can help protect those Jedi and those expensive units that are like over 150 points and stuff like that, that's kind of a good thing. It's not going to be all game long, because eventually those troops are going to get suppressed or going to get killed, and then the Jedi or the Grievous or whatever type of commander or operative you're running is eventually going to have to fight alone. But it's a decent little system, and it's all right so far. It helps mitigate that the loss of cover, in my opinion. So I mentioned Jedi. Let's talk about the big change to Deflect. This is a massive change to the game. I tend to run a lot of Force users, so this is a big deal for me. Not everybody has Deflect, but a lot of the Jedi and Sith have Deflect, and it used to be that you needed a dodge token in order to gain that search to block and then the trigger Deflect. They've changed Deflect. They made it a little bit worse in that at most you can reflect only 1 damage back at your attacker, which was the norm. Very few times would you deflect more than 1, but it still would happen sometimes. So they made a ceiling on that, just 1. If it works, it's only 1 damage back to your attacker. But the overwhelmingly positive thing about this is that you no longer need to have a dodge token. If there's a ranged attack that's incoming, you have the deflect keyword, you automatically get surge to block for defense, and you automatically deflect 1 if you rolled at least 1 surge. I will point out that when attack says it's immune to deflect, that does mean that your character loses not only the ability to deflect the 1 damage back, but also basically deflect is not active, so they also lose that defensive surge. So it's a pretty, I think immune to deflect also got kind of heavily impacted by these changes, and maybe they're a little bit more useful now, even if you end up not just about, I'm not going to take a damage, but I'm actually way more likely to get this damage through. So that's a very cool thing. It's just really, really helpful for those Jedi, especially for somebody like me who likes to run Darth Maul in like kamikaze style, like solo, and if he's got deflect up all the time. Now, deflect does not work in melee, so that is one way to, if you have a Force user coming out and you're like, maybe just don't shoot them, maybe just move into melee and punch them that way, because you're probably more likely to get damage through. So that's Deflect. Let's talk about vehicles. Vehicles have had a ton of changes. Massive changes to vehicles. So one thing is that they can contest objectives now. They cannot gain cover from terrain, although they can gain cover from other things, such as droidicas going to ball mode, or a snow speeder having cover 1 built in. Things like that can still work for vehicles. However, they're just not going to get it from terrain. So that's a big impact. Vehicles have had their armor values heavily reduced. The big armored vehicle, like nobody has full-blown armor as of right now. That is, which does kind of hint that full-blown armor is potentially still coming. But Armor 5 seems to be the high point for big things like the ATST and you know the Gav tanks and stuff like that. So the Armor 5 is a pretty good amount of armor. It does mean, however, that if you've got like a Rebel Z6 unit or something like that, and you know what, like we're gonna try and do everything we can. We're gonna throw as many dice into this thing, and you know, we don't have any impact, but now we still have a chance of getting damage through. And while that sounds cool on the surface, you're probably not going to roll that much. And if you have a dice pool that big and no impact, you're probably better off throwing it at some troops that you're more likely to get those hits through. However, you know, there are lots of other vehicles that have lower armor values. Like the ATRT got hit pretty hard with like armor 2. So ATRT, actually, you have a more realistic chance. It's like it had the old style of heavy cover now. So ATRT, you can definitely get some wounds through. And that's a big thing. Some of the vehicles that have cover too, you know, like I ran the LAT LE the other day, and like having cover 1 is really helpful because it's still an extra save. Of course, they were all blank for me, but they're still having that extra save. It's still cool. It's more of an opportunity to roll dice, and that's fun. But yeah, also ground vehicles get a free reposition at the start of their activation before they move. They can basically, it's in addition to the reposition keyword. So if you have reposition in your ground vehicle, you get that little pivot, and then you can move, and then you get that other pivot. So they tried to help out in vehicles in a lot of ways while also making them killable, and that seems pretty cool. Another thing I love about vehicles is you don't have the 3 different types of damage that can happen if you hit your resiliency. Now you're just damaged. If your resiliency triggers, you're just damaged, and you got to roll a white die. And if you get a blank, you get 1 less action. And the same thing with Ion too. It does the same thing. So if you're damaged and ionized, you might get no actions. So that's kind of a big deal. It's kind of a big deal. Let's talk about Withdraw. This one is really big. A lot of these changes have been favorable for me. Withdraw is one that I do not like. Basically, now Withdraw only takes 1 action. So if we're engaged and I tied up your Jedi, or I tied up a big unit of yours that was about to try and take an objective or whatever, that was a grand strategy, you know, in the old style of Legion, in the old edition. Now Withdraw doesn't really do much, or engaging somebody in melee doesn't really do much, because when that unit activates, they can just do a speed 1 move, get out of the engagement, and then do a whole nother move at their normal speed, or any other action, with the exception of they cannot attack and they cannot stand by. They also cannot move into another melee. So there are a few restrictions on it, but those usually aren't the things you're going to need to do in those cases anyway, at least in the tactical cases, because most of the time you're trying to either get away and get safe, or get to an objective. And if you can do that speed 1 move away, and then a speed 2 or 3 or whatever your speed is, you know, beyond that, that kind of defeats many of the use cases in which case, you know, engaging or tying somebody up into a melee would have been really hurtful to them in the past. So this one really it cripples a lot of the melee encounters and the strategy that goes into that. And now it kind of means that like force push is even more valuable, because it's like one of the only ways to like really stop somebody from getting to an objective. And you know, and that doesn't even really stop it. Just, you know, you can push them backwards. So it's like way better than tying them up with melee now. Which and again, if I do tie you up with melee, you can wait until your heart's content to go ahead and activate and then move. You know, you should be safe from ranged attacks the whole time. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the way Withdraw has worked. There have been a couple of times where I tried to tie up somebody that needed to like drop a bomb on an objective or something like that, and it didn't matter because they're just like, okay, good, I'll just ignore you and keep going, And so I feel the changes to withdraw here, I think could use some work, because I don't like the fact that you can, if I engage you, you can almost completely ignore it and just keep on walking. Don't like that. I say almost because that first move will only be a speed 1 move, but still, it's a feels bad, and I can maybe understand parts of the reason why they did it, but I don't like the way it feels. Like, it feels like it really, again, the strategy's different. I'll probably get used to it, but right now this is one that I'm not in favor of. So there's that. Exemplar. Here's an interesting one. Exemplar has been changed quite a bit, and this one it's more that it's on a lot of different units now. This is a big thing. And the clones have like basically this kind of similar ability. So I'm going to talk about clone changes and Exemplar at the same time. It's now line of sight range 2, so you can and clone ability kind of works basically the same, but it's range 2 now, which really helps clones hold objectives without having to. Again, you have objectives depending on which mission you're doing. They can be spread out all over the place. This makes it a lot easier for clones to still support each other and also contest nearby objectives. So this is and Exemplar is kind of doing the same thing. A lot of leaders have an Exemplar now, kind of letting them be leaders that maybe don't have to be quite so combat-oriented, like Leia or the tactical series droids and things like that. So the Exemplar keyword is pretty cool. However, it's weird because it does feel like the droids that have this have a lot of advantages because of my next and final point, AI. Massive changes to AI, and basically it kind of doesn't exist anymore, at least as a negative. So AI now only works if you're activated, if you pull from the pile, didn't have a face-up order token, and are beyond range 3 of a commander. So this is a massive change, and it does mean that Separatists can run AI units pretty indiscriminately without really having to worry about AI ever triggering, and without having to really worry about their B1 battle line, that B1 chain, and there's so many things you really don't have to worry about, and it opens the door for a lot of new Separatist units. So this is great for Separatist players. It's also bad for people who are going up against Separatist players, and we're planning to maybe try to like reverse you can't issue this guy an order because I got comms jammer and stuff like that. Doesn't matter nearly as much anymore, especially if you're running multiple commanders as a Separatist. Then you have like 2 huge bubbles, because it doesn't have to be a droid commander. It can be Dooku or something like that. Grievous, T-Series, Kraken, whatever, what have you. You just have to have a commander within range 3. So that's a big change. And the fact that droids really get to benefit so much from this AI change, and considering that some droid leaders now have Exemplar, it does make the droids are feeling a little more similar to clones, just a little bit, with the whole we can just share tokens and we don't have to worry about AI anymore. So there's some interest. And now, granted, I say only a little bit more like clones. It's more anecdotal because it's more of a tiptoe in that direction rather than being the same thing. But I think Separatists are the real winners here, and having just played a Separatist list recently, I could definitely see it. I felt it, and Droidicas are back, and certain other units that I struggled to use because AI was just making it really hard for me to B2s, I think, are also big winners in this one. So pretty cool stuff. Now there's dozens more changes to the game, and I could go on and talk about it, but those are 10 big points that have I think had probably some of the biggest impacts on the game. Overall, I think the game still feels like Legion. I still think it's fun and enjoyable. I think that's the most important part. The strategy may have changed a little bit, but the gameplay experience is still fun. I was also concerned that it was going to be more about holding objectives and a lot less about killing. And I do think they have shifted the balance a little bit, but only a little bit more towards objectives. Killing is still a massive important part. If it was like 55-45 before, I think they shifted it closer to like, 60-40. So still in the same ballpark, killing still tremendously important, especially if your opponent's trying to take an objective with only one unit. Killing them completely shuts out on a whole quadrant of the board potentially. So killing still very important. Rolling dice is still very important. It's not just about positioning. It's also about offense. So I very much have enjoyed my new games of Star Wars Legion. And really my biggest complaint beyond withdraw is that big old board they gave us, that has the, your primary objective, secondary objective and stuff. We're not using that anymore. I was using it for a couple of games. I'm just going to be using dice and just kind of setting the cards out, kind of very similar to how I would do it before, just tracking victory points with D6s. If I fill up 2 D6s, that's my 12 points. So that's kind of my approach, because what Legion table has enough room for a whole 8x11 tracker, a lot of, especially if you're in a tournament, is there gonna be room for everybody to have a whole nother table? And not a whole nother table, but like when I was playing in a tournament recently, we like had to set them on the floor at some point, and it was, I'm like, we just don't have to do that. We can just track it with dice, on a smaller formats. I think people are going to come up with smaller dials and smaller ways to track this stuff, but I guess it's helpful at the beginning, just so you can clearly lay out what's going on. Where your points are, what mission, what secondary objective you're playing, what the advantages are, and all of that stuff. Helps to teach the game, but I think once you get used to it, you'll probably set that large scoreboard aside and use a much smaller scoreboard that can actually fit on your table. All right, guys, those are my thoughts on the new edition of Star Wars Legion. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and also in our Discord. Love to have you guys join. Check it out. There's a roles section. You can click on Legion and other games that you're interested. You'll only get the latest and greatest for those games, and that's all in the Discord below. And big thanks to my patrons. There is another battle report up for Legion right now on Patreon for A-Wing levels and above. So if that's something that you're interested in, you want to check those out and get early access to, you can get that, and the links for Patreon are down in the video description below as well. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are absolutely amazing and help make this whole channel possible. I will talk to you later. May the Force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes, and always wash your socks.